Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her swollen belly as she tried to steady her breathing. The dull ache in her lower back had started that morning, and now, by evening, it had grown into something more persistent. She wasn't sure if it was the beginning of labor or just another false alarm, but deep down, she had a feeling that something was different this time. She glanced over at Mark, who was shoving clothes into a duffel bag with the kind of distracted energy that suggested he wasn't really thinking about anything other than himself. He had mentioned the trip with his parents a few days ago, but Sophie never imagined he would actually go. Not when she was this close to giving birth, not when she needed him the most. "Mark," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I don't think you should go." He sighed, not even looking up as he zipped his bag. "Sophie, we've been over this. It's just for a couple of days. My parents have been planning this for weeks, and I already told them I'd come." Her heart pounded with frustration. "I know, but I wasn't having contractions then. I think the baby is coming." That made him pause for half a second before he shook his head and let out a short laugh. "Come on, Sophie. You've said that before. Last week you were convinced you were in labor and it was just Braxton Hicks. You're overthinking it again." Tears pricked at her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the overwhelming sense of abandonment creeping in. "I'm not overthinking. I'm telling you, something feels different." He finally looked at her, but there was no concern in his eyes. Only exasperation. "Look, even if you do go into labor, it's not like it happens instantly. First babies take hours, sometimes days. You'll have plenty of time. Just call an Uber to the hospital if it happens." She stared at him in disbelief. "You expect me to go through this alone? What if something goes wrong?" Mark groaned, rubbing his temples. "Nothing is going to go wrong, Sophie. Women have been giving birth for thousands of years. You're acting like you're the first person to ever have a baby." His words felt like a slap. She had spent the last 9 months carrying their child, enduring the nausea, the sleepless nights, the constant discomfort. She had been the one going to every doctor's appointment, tracking every kick and heartbeat, doing everything she could to make sure their baby was healthy, and now, at the moment she needed him the most, he was acting like she was just an inconvenience. "Mark, please," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't want to do this without you." He sighed again, but this time there was an edge of impatience. "Sophie, I need a break, okay? This whole pregnancy thing has been stressful, and I just need a couple of days to clear my head. My parents are expecting me. I can't back out now." Her stomach clenched, not just from the pain, but from the horrifying realization that nothing she said would change his mind. He wasn't going to stay. Mark slung his bag over his shoulder, checking his phone as he walked toward the door. "I'll call when I land. Try to relax, okay?" And then he was gone. Sophie sat frozen, staring at the door, willing herself to believe this wasn't really happening. But the sharp stab of another contraction brought her crashing back to reality. She clenched the bedsheet, breathing through the pain, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do now? She grabbed her phone and called Mark, but it went straight to voicemail. Her fingers trembled as she typed out a message. "Please come back. I think I'm in labor." No response. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, making her gasp. Panic surged through her veins. She needed to get to the hospital, but how? Her mother lived out of state, and most of her friends were either working or had their own families to take care of. She thought about calling an ambulance, but the idea of being wheeled into a hospital alone, surrounded by strangers, terrified her. She took a deep breath and forced herself to think rationally. If Mark wasn't coming back, she had to get herself there. She grabbed her hospital bag, which she had packed weeks ago, and slowly made her way to the front door. Every movement sent another wave of pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. By the time she reached her car, she was already sweating, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she climbed into the driver's seat. As she pulled out of the driveway, she checked her phone one last time. Nothing from Mark. But there was a new post on his social media, a picture of him at the airport smiling with his parents, captioned, "Much-needed family getaway." A fresh wave of betrayal washed over her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. She had more important things to focus on now. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and drove herself to the hospital. Sophie gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as another contraction ripped through her body. A sharp, twisting pain coiled in her abdomen, forcing her to suck in a breath through clenched teeth. She'd read about contractions before, timing them, breathing through them, recognizing the difference between real and false labor, but now, sitting alone in her car on the way to the hospital, she realized nothing could have truly prepared her for this. The streets were eerily quiet for a late evening, the streetlights casting long, trembling shadows on the pavement. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples, her heart racing as she kept one eye on the road and one on the clock. The hospital was only 15 minutes away. 15 minutes that stretched into eternity, with every sharp jolt of pain that rolled through her body. She considered calling someone, anyone, just to have a voice guiding her through this, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. Mark was gone. Her mother was hundreds of miles away. Her closest friends had families of their own, and she hated the thought of waking them in the middle of the night, only to burden them with something her husband should have been there for. Her vision blurred with tears as she pulled into the hospital parking lot, struggling to focus on the glowing red emergency sign ahead. She had barely put the car in park when another contraction surged through her, this one so intense that she let out an involuntary cry, her hands gripping her stomach. A soft knock on the window made her jump. A hospital security guard stood outside, his brow furrowed with concern. Sophie fumbled with the door handle, pushing it open with shaky hands. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. I think I'm in labor," she gasped, struggling to swing her legs out of the car. "I drove myself here." The guard's eyes widened, and he immediately reached for his radio. "We need a wheelchair at the emergency entrance. Pregnant woman in active labor." Then he turned back to her. "Don't worry, ma'am. We've got you." Sophie barely registered his words as another contraction hit, stealing what little breath she had left. Within seconds, a nurse appeared with a wheelchair, and Sophie collapsed into it, gripping the armrests like a lifeline. The nurse moved quickly, pushing her through the automatic doors and into the bright, sterile hospital. Everything became a blur of voices and movement. A receptionist asking for her name, a nurse wrapping a blood pressure cuff around her arm, a doctor leaning over her, asking questions she barely had the strength to answer. "Where is your husband?" one of the nurses asked gently. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. He's not here." The nurse's face softened with understanding, but she didn't press for more details. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "You're not alone. We're going to take care of you, okay?" Sophie wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that these strangers could somehow fill the gaping void that Mark had left behind. But as another contraction tore through her, all she could feel was the crushing weight of loneliness. They wheeled her into a private room, dimly lit and quiet except for the steady beeping of machines. A nurse helped her change into a hospital gown, and soon she was hooked up to monitors tracking both her contractions and the baby's heartbeat. The rhythmic sound of the baby's heart filled the room, fast and strong, and for the first time since she had left the house, Sophie felt a flicker of relief. She wasn't alone, not really. She had her baby. The hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Nurses came and went, checking her progress, offering words of encouragement, but the ache of abandonment sat heavy in her chest, mingling with the physical agony. At one point, between contractions, she reached for her phone with trembling fingers. No missed calls, no messages from Mark. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened his social media page. There he was, smiling in a photo taken at what looked like a beachside restaurant, his parents on either side of him. The caption read, "Nothing like a little getaway with family." Sophie's stomach twisted, not from labor this time, but from the sheer, gut-wrenching betrayal. He hadn't even bothered to check on her. She typed out a message with shaking hands. "I'm in the hospital. The baby is coming." She hit send and stared at the screen, willing the typing indicator to appear. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Still nothing. The betrayal settled deeper into her bones, cold and suffocating. She didn't know if she was angrier at him for leaving or at herself for expecting anything different. As the contractions intensified, the doctor came in to check her dilation. "You're progressing well," he said. "It won't be long now." Sophie nodded, barely able to process his words through the pain. She clenched her fists, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she refused to break down. She refused to give Mark that power over her. When the moment finally came, the room filled with a quiet urgency. Nurses moved quickly, preparing for delivery. The doctor positioned himself at the foot of the bed, giving her instructions in a calm, steady voice. "You're doing great, Sophie. Just a few more pushes." She clenched her jaw, digging deep into reserves of strength she didn't even know she had. With one final, desperate push, a sharp, searing pain shot through her, and then, all at once, relief. A new sound filled the air. A baby's cry. Tears streamed down Sophie's face as the doctor lifted her newborn, a tiny, wriggling bundle, and placed him on her chest. "It's a boy," the nurse whispered, her voice full of warmth. Sophie let out a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she touched his soft, delicate skin. His cries quieted as she held him close, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest against hers. A fresh wave of emotion crashed over her. Love, relief, sorrow. Everything she had feared about being alone in this moment had melted away the second she laid eyes on her son. She kissed the top of his head, breathing him in. "I've got you," she whispered. "I promise." As she cradled her newborn, exhausted but filled with a newfound sense of strength, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen. "Mark, sorry was busy. How's the baby?" Sophie stared at the message, her heart hammering in her chest. And for the first time in months, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Sophie stared at her phone screen, Mark's message glowing in the dim hospital room. "Sorry was busy. How's the baby?" She read it over and over, her mind struggling to process the sheer casualness of it. Sorry, as if he had simply missed a dinner reservation, not the birth of his own child. Busy, as if whatever he was doing, laughing with his parents, lounging on the beach, sipping cocktails, had been more important than the life-changing moment she had just endured alone. She exhaled sharply, feeling a sting in her chest that had nothing to do with the labor she had just gone through. She wanted to scream at him, to type out every ounce of pain, rage, and betrayal boiling inside her. But as she glanced down at the tiny boy nestled against her chest, his breathing soft and rhythmic, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just Sophie anymore. She was someone's mother now, and she refused to let her son's first moments be tainted by a man who had already proven he couldn't be relied on. With a slow, deliberate movement, she locked her phone and set it down on the hospital tray. She wasn't ready to respond. Maybe she never would be. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A nurse peeked in with a warm smile. "How are we doing, Mom?" Sophie swallowed past the lump in her throat and nodded. "We're okay." "Glad to hear it." The nurse stepped inside, adjusting the monitors and checking her IV. "Has Dad arrived yet?" Sophie hesitated. She had known this question was coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. "No," she admitted. "He's not here." The nurse's hands paused for just a second before she gave Sophie a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, honey." Sophie forced a tight smile. "Me too." The nurse finished her checks and placed a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You're not alone. You've got that beautiful baby boy, and you've got us. Anything you need, just press the call button." As the door clicked shut behind her, Sophie looked down at her son again. His tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, his face scrunched up in a peaceful dream. She had never felt more alone in her life. Hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and emotions Sophie couldn't even name. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking to feed her son, to listen to doctors give her instructions, to sign paperwork. The hospital became a bubble, a space where time blurred and the outside world barely seemed real. It wasn't until the next afternoon that she finally picked up her phone again. She had expected more messages from Mark, some kind of follow-up, maybe even a phone call. But there was nothing, just that one message. Her hands trembled as she opened their text thread. "He's here. 7 Elbs 4 Oz. Healthy." She stared at the words for a long moment before finally pressing send. Seconds later, the typing indicator appeared. Then, "That's great! When are you coming home?" Her breath caught. That was what he had to say? "No, I'm sorry. No, I should have been there. Just when are you coming home?" A cold realization settled over her. He wasn't asking about her. He wasn't asking if she was okay, if she needed anything. He was asking when she would come back to their house, to the life where he could pretend nothing had happened. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, a dozen furious responses running through her mind. But in the end, she just locked her phone again and set it aside. She didn't owe him anything right now. The hospital released her the next day, but she didn't go home. Not to the house she shared with Mark. Not to the place where his presence, his absence, would haunt her. Instead, she went to her best friend Rachel's apartment. Rachel had been calling nonstop since she heard the news, and when Sophie finally picked up and admitted she had given birth alone, Rachel had cursed so loudly that Sophie had to pull the phone away from her ear. "You're coming here," Rachel had insisted. "I don't care what he says, you and the baby are coming here." Sophie didn't argue. Rachel met her outside the hospital, practically vibrating with fury as she helped Sophie into the car. "Do you want me to kill him?" Rachel asked, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Because I will. No jury would convict me." Sophie let out a tired laugh, her first real one in days. "I'll keep that in mind." Rachel glanced over at the sleeping newborn in the car seat, her face softened. "He's perfect, Soph. You did this. And you did it without that asshole." Sophie swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotions from spilling over. She nodded, blinking quickly. "Yeah, I did. And you did it without that asshole." Sophie swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotions from spilling over. She nodded, blinking quickly. "Yeah, I did." For the next few days, Sophie focused on nothing but her son. She fed him, held him, learned the rhythms of his tiny, fragile existence. In the quiet moments, when the apartment was still and the world outside felt far away, she let herself feel everything. The love, the grief, the crushing disappointment. Mark sent a few more messages, each one more impatient than the last. "Are you home yet? Why are you ignoring me? I don't get why you're being so dramatic." That last one nearly made her throw her phone across the room. Dramatic. That was what he thought of her, even now, even after everything. Her fingers shook as she typed out a response. "You left me alone to give birth. I needed you, and you chose to go on vacation. That's not something I can just move past, Mark." His reply came within seconds. "I told you I thought you'd be fine. You're acting like I abandoned you or something." She let out a bitter laugh. "Like I abandoned you." She stared at the words, feeling something inside her break. Not in a painful way, but in a final way. A door closing, a tether snapping. For so long she had made excuses for him. She had convinced herself that he would change, that he would grow up, that one day he would be the man she needed. But this was who he was. And she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting for someone who had already proven he would never show up when it mattered. She looked down at her son, peacefully sleeping in her arms. He deserved better than this. She deserved better than this. Sophie took a deep breath and typed out one last message. "I'm not coming back, Mark. We're done." She hit send, then she turned off her phone, held her son close, and let herself breathe for the first time in a long, long time. Sophie had always imagined that the hardest part of leaving Mark would be the moment she told him it was over. She thought she would feel doubt, fear, maybe even regret. But as she sat on Rachel's couch, holding her son close to her chest, the only thing she felt was relief. A weight had lifted from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she had been carrying for years. She had turned off her phone after sending that final message, not wanting to deal with whatever response Mark would throw her way. She could already predict it. Anger, denial, maybe even some half-hearted attempt at an apology. But she knew, deep down, that none of it would change anything. Words meant nothing without actions, and Mark had shown her exactly who he was when he left her alone to give birth. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for him to change. She was done waiting. Rachel sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea. "So, what now?" Sophie exhaled slowly, shifting her baby in her arms as he let out a soft sigh in his sleep. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I can't go back." Rachel nodded, as if she had already known the answer. Good. For the next few days, Sophie focused on healing. Physically, emotionally, mentally, the exhaustion of new motherhood was overwhelming, but every time she looked at her son, she knew she had made the right decision. He deserved a mother who was strong enough to walk away from a relationship that would only bring pain. Then, one afternoon, she finally turned her phone back on. She wasn't surprised to see dozens of messages from Mark. The first few were predictable: frustration, confusion, blaming her for overreacting. But then, as the hours passed and she hadn't responded, his tone shifted. "Soph, I get that you're mad, but can we just talk? Come on, don't do this. We have a family now. I love you. Don't throw everything away over one mistake." She scoffed. One mistake. As if this was just some minor lapse in judgment instead of the culmination of years of selfishness. And then the last message: "If you take my son away from me, you'll regret it." Sophie's stomach twisted. It wasn't outright threatening, but she knew Mark well enough to hear the warning beneath his words. He had never been violent, never raised a hand to her, but she knew he didn't like losing control. And now, for the first time, he was realizing that he had lost control over her. She showed the messages to Rachel, who pursed her lips. "You should talk to a lawyer, just in case." Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. She had no intention of keeping Mark from his son. If he wanted to be involved, she wouldn't stop him. But she also wasn't going to let him intimidate her into coming back. The next week was a blur of phone calls and paperwork. She found a family lawyer who helped her understand her rights, what steps she needed to take to ensure custody was on her terms. The lawyer advised her to document everything: Mark's absence, his messages, even the fact that he hadn't bothered to show up at the hospital. "If he fights for custody, we need to be prepared," the lawyer said. Sophie wasn't sure if Mark would actually go that far. She knew he cared about appearances more than anything else, and the idea of being seen as the abandoned father probably didn't sit well with him, but she wasn't going to take any chances. A week after she had left, Mark finally called. She debated letting it go to voicemail, but something inside her told her it was time to face him. She took a deep breath and answered. "Sophie," he said, his voice tight. "What the hell is going on? You just disappear and ignore me?" She closed her eyes, steadying herself. "I didn't disappear, Mark. I had our son, and you weren't there. That's on you." He let out a sharp breath. "I told you I didn't think you'd go into labor that fast. How was I supposed to know?" "You weren't supposed to know, Mark. You were supposed to be there, but you weren't. And that tells me everything I need to know about where your priorities are." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he said, "So that's it? You're just done?" She looked down at her baby, his tiny fingers curled around hers. "Yeah," she said softly, "I'm done." Another pause. Then his voice hardened. "You don't get to just take my kid and walk away, Sophie." Her grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not keeping him from you, but I'm not going to raise him in a home where his father sees his mother as an afterthought. If you want to be in his life, you're going to have to prove it." Mark scoffed. "Oh, so now I have to prove myself to you?" "You have to prove yourself to him." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Mark didn't have a response for that. When the call ended, Sophie felt an unexpected sense of calm. She had been terrified of this moment, of having to finally say the words out loud, but now that she had, she felt lighter, stronger. The weeks passed, and Sophie settled into her new reality. It wasn't easy. Being a single mother was exhausting, overwhelming, sometimes even terrifying. But it was also hers. Every decision, every late-night feeding, every tiny milestone belonged to her and her son. Mark sent messages now and then, sometimes asking about the baby, sometimes trying to guilt her into talking. But he never once asked to visit. He never made an effort to show up. And that told Sophie everything she needed to know. One evening, as she rocked her son to sleep, Rachel sat beside her on the couch. "You're doing amazing, you know that?" Sophie let out a small laugh. "Most days, I feel like I'm barely keeping it together." Rachel nudged her. "That's how you know you're a good mom. The shitty ones don't worry about whether they're doing enough." Sophie glanced down at her son, his tiny face relaxed in sleep. "I just want him to know he's loved, that he'll never have to wonder if he's important." Rachel smiled. "He will, because he's got you." Sophie exhaled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had spent so long thinking she needed Mark, that she needed to fix things, to hold on to a relationship that had been broken for years. But sitting here, with her son safe in her arms and a future that belonged entirely to her, she realized something. She hadn't lost anything. She had gained everything.